You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 11th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Is anyone still reading the Geneva Conventions? Is US President Donald Trump reordering the world quite how he thinks he is? And the US state leading the flight from modern medicine? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Leila, Molana-Allen and Brant will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll meet the last violin maker in Palestine. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined by Brant, the BBC's former China correspondent, and Leila Molana-Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent. Leila is, as of this particular instant of this broadcast, in a cab, but she will be here very presently. In the meantime, Robin, you, first of all, I understand, will shortly be travelling viscerally.
Yeah. I mean, we're looking at our summer. We're looking at plans for the family. The weather's turning in London, but my son is going back to China for the first time in about 4 years. We lived there for 7 years. The end of it fairly traumatic for all of us, but nonetheless, he's been studying Mandarin. He's discovered he's going back to Guangzhou, which is just a city like so many others around that region, a complete assault on the senses. He's going back there for a couple of weeks, so he's excited about the language. He's excited about going back to the place he lived in for so long. He's excited about being the first of us who's going to see what it's like after a long time having left China. So, yeah. I
mean, how long is it again since you left?
So we came back towards the end of 22 after a couple of years of the whole country dealing with COVID and a lockdown. Took a couple of years here to settle in as well. But yeah, he's going back. We've thought about going back. He's the first to go back. It's a school trip, but he's so excited about the language, about the culture. And like I say, Guangzhou, I mean, God, the airport there is just overwhelming in terms of finding your way around that place, like so many of those airports there.
Well, actually curious to hear how he gets on, so do come and tell us all about it when you're next on the Daily. And we are joined, as advertised, by Leila Molana-Allen. Leila, I had every confidence. How are you doing? Take some deep breaths, have a glass of water. Welcome to the show.
Somewhat breathless. It was very glamorous to be running through the streets of London, having had a screaming argument with a taxi driver. So pleased to be here.
I mean, running through the streets after having had a screaming argument with the taxi driver, that must take you back to Beirut at least a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Istanbul, even more so, where really, if you're not arguing with a taxi driver, then were you even there?
Well, we will start in Switzerland, and with something which didn't happen last week. An international conference had been scheduled in Geneva, concerned with the conventions on behaviour in wartime named after that city and how they might be applied to those Palestinian territories presently occupied or besieged by Israel. However, Switzerland then had a change of mind, calling the whole thing off after objections from both Israeli and Arab representatives. Lest anybody anticipate a rare moment of hands across the barricades consensus, Israel didn't want it to happen because they suspected an Israel-bashing carnival. The Arabs thought it would be an impotent gabfest, and all were probably in their own way right. Leila, this is very much your ambit, so I'm assuming you've got your breath back by now. Would this have actually accomplished anything, or was everybody basically right, if for different reasons, to just think, nah, can't be bothered?
Well, I may be about to lose my breath again with frustration over this. Look, nothing was going to be achieved by this, right? This was essentially... Switzerland was terrified about having to have this meeting in the first place. They didn't want to hold it. But they are the designatory country, and as such, they need to be the people to host this. And it was necessary to host a meeting. But essentially, they were trying to keep it as apolitical as possible. So when you even look at the document they were going to sign, all it was going to say was, we reaffirm the fact that we agree with the Geneva Conventions, not even specifically in the case of the Palestinian territories. Now, what happened was that they invited 196 signatory countries and essentially no one wanted to come. Initially, it was that Israel turned around and said this is another form of legal warfare against Israel, with no real justification for saying so. And the Arab states basically said there's no reason for us to go to this because you're not actually going to do anything in order to sanction Israel and what they're doing. What this all ties into is what happened last week, which is when this round of the ceasefire ended, Israel turned around and said, as we haven't been able to agree a next round, we are going to freeze all aid going into Gaza, and now we're going to cut off their electricity as well. That is very obviously against the Fourth Geneva Convention, which requires an occupying power to protect the health and the rights and the access to basic needs of the people living in that occupied territory, as well as the fact that using starvation as a tool of war, which is what's happening here, is a war crime. Now, we're in this situation where Israel this time is not, previously they've said, no, we're not starving people in Gaza, they have enough food. What they've actually said this time is yes. So Gideon Saar, the defence minister, turned around and said the day they did it, yeah, actually Hamas didn't give us what we wanted, and so we froze aid. We weren't going to give it to them for free.
Well, this does prompt the key question here, which is that everybody, as Leila was intimating, has signed or ratified the Geneva Conventions, all 196 UN states. Some have skipped one or two of the three additional protocols, but basically everybody is supposed to be on board with these things. Do they practically mean anything, though?
I think what, for me, is most revelatory about the events of the last few days is what it means for the continuing legitimacy and the credibility of these international bodies and their ability to enforce these conventions and sanction those who don't enforce them and refuse to abide by what in years gone by they have promised they would do. I mean, the United Nations, of course, is the ultimate body that we often envisage when we're talking about this, often criticised as a talking shop, but nonetheless retains some of the teeth that it has had in that post-war era. But I think when we look to Donald Trump and in terms of the way the the pendulum has swung so dramatically in terms of some of their allegiances around the table at the United Nations and the Permanent Security Council members in particular, for me, we are seeing, I think, not so much a stasis, but a considerable undermining of the ability of these international bodies to really continue to be legitimate and to retain their credibility. And this, in some ways, is just the latest example of that.
I mean, do they have an effect, though, at least in your observance, Leila, covering conflict up close on the ground? Because it has been a while, but certainly when covering conflict myself, I have seen soldiers, thinking specifically of British and American ones, earnestly discussing the Geneva Conventions, being reminded of them by their officers and stuff, and at least being suggested there is a framework for how we're supposed to be behaving here.
That's exactly it. The fact that there is a framework for how we're supposed to be behaving is extremely important, right? Firstly, because it encourages a certain type of behaviour and training in that type of behaviour. And secondly, because it means that there are sanctions and punishments if you don't do that, and we can bring those people to account. I mean, if we look, for instance, at this kind of phenomenon of IDF soldiers on TikTok posting videos that absolutely document war crimes committed by their regiments, with great glee, putting photographs of that on Tinder, and now being in some countries under threat of arrest when they travel because we've got that documentation. And it's kind of incredible that the Israeli government has allowed them to do that, but it suggests that the mood is such that they wanted to keep these soldiers buoyed and, willing to fight. But if we're at that stage, when I've spoken to British and American troops about this, they've said things to me like, if we did one of those things on one day in Iraq or Afghanistan, we would have gone to jail for life. So we're really at that stage now. The problem that we're facing now is that it's not so much anymore that people are denying these crimes, as I said, as that they're saying, and so what? And the problem is that now the US is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, as is Israel. It's not a signatory, the US, to several of the other institutions that kind of govern, including the ICC, very importantly. But when you've got a situation where you have an indicted war criminal, Netanyahu, being invited as the first foreign leader into Trump's office and glad-handed by him, not only that, but Germany, which, in many ways was one of the founding countries of these things after the Second World War, turning around to Netanyahu and saying, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that arrest warrant. Come and see us. We won't let anyone take you. If you're in that situation, then, if you've documented the crimes and you've brought them to court and they've been proven and you've issued the arrest warrant and everyone just sort of shrugs, where are we and what purpose do these things have going forward? And if we don't have that framework, what framework do we have?
Well, At which we will pivot, Robin, from the micro to the macro. Do you think, I mean, and again, reflecting especially on your experience reporting from China, whose observance of such strictures has always been pretty pick and choose, I mean, do you fear that we are on the cusp of some sort of age of state lawlessness, of countries perhaps following the increasing example of the United States, just going, so what, we'll do what we like, who's going to stop us?
Well, I think when the United States is behaving in the way it's behaving under the presidency of Donald Trump at the moment, it's very difficult for some critics, either domestic or international, of what he's doing, to turn to others and say to them they shouldn't ape that, they shouldn't copy that, they shouldn't behave in that way. I mean, China's history very much is of kind of perfidy, of choosing what suits it then and what doesn't suit it at other times. I mean, it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, a transformative moment for its economy and for the rest of the world in terms of globalization, and uses the tools of the WTO to kind of punish and harass other members, whilst at the same time repeatedly not abiding by those own rules itself. And that may sound slightly trite, but that has huge impacts on other economies around the world and China's ability to trade with other people. UNCLOS, which was the UN body which ruled about the South China Sea almost a decade ago, China has ignored that ruling and claims it retains sovereignty over most of that maritime area. It's had border disputes with India, with Bhutan, and on a much more smaller level, it has these kind of extrajudicial police stations in various countries around the world. Chinese police officers stationed in these formal yet informal foreign postings, which have been very strange and very bizarre. So countless examples of times when China has held up these international rules of governance and told others they must abide by them, and yet refusing to do that when it doesn't suit its interests.
Well, let's move on somewhat and look at three countries whose adherence to the Geneva Conventions has been over the journey selective. Heartwarmingly, Russia, China and Iran are undertaking their annual joint naval exercise in the Gulf of Oman. The drills are officially known as Security Belt 2025. Their advertised focus on piracy and terrorism, insert own jokes about whether they're for or against. It is not a massive production as these things go. Russia has sent two of its as yet unsunk corvettes, China a destroyer and a supply ship, Iran a corvette and a patrol ship, but this is at least as much a symbolic as a strategic demonstration. Leila, in and of itself, it's probably reasonable to be clear there's nothing much actually wrong with this, is there? I mean, if three broadly allied nations wish to sail their navies round and round in circles in international waters, that's fine, right?
No, I mean, and they're not particularly doing anything either. They're essentially sort of doing joint exercises. What they're doing is they're saber rattling ever so slightly. The reason that it's, a big deal is because these are nasty countries that the West doesn't like. But to be quite frank, what we were just hearing there, a country that does what suits it when it feels like it and doesn't when it doesn't. Doesn't that sound quite familiar? A pretty big Western nation right now. So, where those lines are drawn are changing slightly. Now, look, the Iran-Russia alliance, of course, is one that we've seen for many, many years. And even before it was a military alliance, it was a trade alliance. That has been shaken up a bit by Syria, right? Because they don't have, while they still have sort of the same enemies and the same friends, they don't have kind of one consistent place where they are pouring all their work and their money into to try and maintain. Now, Iran has completely abandoned Syria and is extremely worried about the state of Hezbollah. On the other hand, Russia is trying to keep its bases on the Syrian coast, and that has concerned some Iranian leaders because they're worried that there may be some concessions made. So there's certainly going to be some work there to try and sort of repair and maintain that relationship. China is the sort of very interesting one here because that's the country that sort of is really, setting off red flags for people in this alliance, because actually if China did any more than sort of cooperate with these two, we could be looking at a pretty powerful both military and economic dynamic. So that's what's got everyone running scared. But at the moment, they do seem to be just sort of saying, look, if you don't want to work with us, other people will.
On that thought, Robin, what is in this relationship for China? Would they not think that two countries like Russia and Iran are somewhat beneath them, not really the company they would like to be keeping?
Well, I mean, China's economy is vastly bigger than Iran, certainly, and definitely Russia. But it takes a lot of oil from Iran. It has a very important relationship in terms of energy supply with Iran. It helps enable and facilitate to a certain extent through trade Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. That remains important for China's economy. I think there's a practical element to this as well. It's showing the world that these exercises are beneficial for the navies of each of these countries and their abilities to work together. China doesn't have that much experience of fighting wars. The US does, the UK does, France does. China doesn't. And that's a small element of this, but nonetheless important. It's also about projecting power, and in particular maritime power. China has huge ambitions to grow its navy, to increase in sophistication its naval presence, and to become far more assertive within its immediate eastern maritime boundaries, but beyond that Japanese archipelago as well, and to become maybe even the dominant Pacific force. So that's important. It's also about embedding this alliance between these three countries. I think we're 5 years now into these exercises. It's about them working together, but it's underpinned, as was said earlier, by a very important trade relationship between China, Iran and Russia, to the benefit of those two countries. There's latter countries more, but there is a trade relationship here that's important for each country's economies.
But is there a meaningful alliance here, Leila, other than one of convenience? Because with the transatlantic alliance, which we were all terribly excited about up until about 2 months ago, you could see, though, that there was, one would like to think, is a commonality between the United States and Europe. These are liberal democracies, rule of law, etc., etc., etc. Russia, China, Iran, we have what? We have a sort of communist tyranny, a post-communist petro-state turned gangster state, and an Islamic republic. And we have in this alliance, one, an Islamic republic, and another country which is locking up Muslims by the million. There doesn't really seem to be much in the way of common values or purpose.
This is not an alliance of ideals, and certainly from the side of Iran and Russia, that's not really what they're looking for. This isn't about sort of political agreements on things. What this is about is, excuse my French, this is a fuck you to the West, right? Essentially, what happens here, and this is China's great power, is that China has for a long time said, look, as long as you don't get involved in our politics, we really don't care what yours are. So China essentially undercuts sanctions. That's what they do, right? So you sanction Iran, you sanction Russia, you sanction Syria. China just comes in and gives them whatever they want. And of course, China has all of that to give. They have the tech, they have the agriculture, they have all the industrial items, they have pretty much anything anyone could need. I mean, when you go to Iran, and that's been happening for years and years. I remember going to Iran as a child, and you could get anything you wanted with Chinese branding on the back. You could get any, films that were banned, you could get a version that had gone through China somehow and been ripped off. The same thing happens in Russia. And the other thing that's very important, certainly in Syria, which, as I say, was a very key focus for both these countries until very recently, is very important in Iran as well, and could be increasingly important to Russia, is that China will also go in and build anywhere, regardless of the politics. And that's actually a really important friend to have as well, somebody who will come in and rebuild infrastructure for you and figure out, how you're going to essentially, rebuild areas that have been destroyed or that have been stopped from being reconstructed because of sanctions. So they're an incredibly useful friend to have, and, as I say, a really dangerous one for the power balance that when the West tries to impose its desires by using tools like everyone turning their backs on these countries.
Robin, should we therefore, just before we move off this subject, be more concerned about another recent enterprise by the People's Liberation Army Navy, which was circumnavigating Australia and on the way conducting no-notice live fire drills in the Tasman Sea?
Yeah,
I mean, again, all technically things they are well within their rights to do, but they didn't have to do it.
As is Russia, fully entitled to sail its boats through the English Channel at various times. I think that the relationship between Beijing and Canberra is much improved, isn't it? You're selling your wine to China again now, and everyone's very happy, and the ore exports are back on as well. But this was, I think, one of the most kind of unsettling demonstrations of China's, as I said earlier, growing maritime military ambitions. And it certainly seemed to catch not just just the Australians, but the New Zealanders off guard as well. And I think for me, it was China seeking to exploit the current kind of uncertainties around Ukraine, around Russia, around Donald Trump's leadership in the White House. And it just seemed to be something that was unexpected. I think Anthony Albanese, correct me if I'm wrong here, was somewhat caught off guard.
Everybody was caught somewhat off guard, and it did stir up certainly what is in Australia. I think slightly less so in New Zealand, but Australia, for almost as long as Europeans have been living there, has had this sort of strange atavistic terror of China. It did stir up quite a, well, as you will have noted yourself, quite a response. But we will move on, and we will persist, however, with a theme of shifting global allegiances. It appears apparently the case that the United States would now rather be friends with Russia than with any European nations which from time to time send troops to fight America's wars and or hold elections. Not for the first time in the presidencies of Donald Trump, however, his actions are having consequences he may not have intended, anticipated or wanted. His whimsical application of tariffs has forged closer trading ties between countries seeking new markets, notably Vietnam and Indonesia, and his ideas for rebuilding Gaza as Fort Lauderdale on the Mediterranean are causing Arab countries to wonder if they might be better off dealing with less weird superpowers, if they can find one. Leila, the eternal question where Trump is concerned, is this all actually what he intends? Is he presiding over some game of five-dimensional chess the rest of us cannot comprehend, or does he simply have no idea what he's doing?
Look, my very strong impression of Trump and his administration, and when you speak to people who are currently kind of negotiating with them, is essentially that he doesn't want to have to deal with it. Right. But he also doesn't want it to be happening, and he doesn't want it to get in his way. So his attitude is, and I mean, Steve Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, is a guy who speaks in much less sort of violent and let's rip everything apart tones than his boss does. He sort of says, well, actually, these things are quite important, but Trump's got big ideas. Essentially, what he does is he turns around and he says, look, this is what I'm going to throw out there. If you don't like it, come up with something better. And what I will say that what the combination of this conflict and both the Biden and Trump administration, but more recently the Trump administration's attitude to it, has done is to do something that Arabs have been begging for a long time, which is to bring Arab nations back together into some form of leadership, right, which they have not done for a long time. I mean, previous to October 7th, we were seeing normalization with Israel. Saudi Arabia was just about to do so, which people were completely horrified by. Now, of course, they're saying that's absolutely not going to happen. Syria having a sort of Arab-leaning leadership, again, is really helping with that. And they've made very clear that while they are close to Turkey, that really Arab states is what they want to see. So you've got kind of MBS in Saudi Arabia. You've certainly got Sisi in Egypt really stepping up. They've been quite an isolationist state for years, and suddenly they've turned around. They're hosting all these Gaza-Israel talks. They're the ones that managed to keep the ceasefire on track. They're starting to talk about, all these different options for rebuilding Gaza in a way that allows Palestinians to stay in Gaza and provides proper support from Arab states. It's, as always, Jordan's been very supportive, but Jordan also has stepped back from its US alliance. They have started to say, actually, this isn't unconditional. It's not unconditional, you can keep your troops here. It's not unconditional. And actually, if you have no respect for Arab people and you have no respect for the lives of Arab children, then, Queen Rania is a Palestinian. Then we're not willing to work with you anymore. So seeing those nations coming together and not only trying to negotiate with the Trump administration, but actually saying we're going to have our own meetings about this, not just to make statements, but to make proper plans funded by ourselves. They've got great funding from Qatar, great funding from Saudi Arabia, potentially other nations too, and we're going to make our own plans. And if you don't like it, then maybe you're going to have to negotiate and give us something in return.
I mean, Robin, it is all an extraordinary illustration of the degree to which, for about 80 years at least, the rest of the world has come to regard the United States as a sort of fixed point. Whether you were for it or against it, you at least understood what it was about. And now nobody really seems to know. And is it possible, I mentioned the example of Indonesia and Vietnam there, is it possible that there might actually be opportunities here for countries who think, well, maybe we do have to reorient ourselves while the United States is doing whatever it's doing for however long it's going to do it?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's being forced to look around, aren't they, and consider who their friends are, who their enemies are, and where a middle or a third way is. I mean, I think one of the most obvious alliances to talk about, not dissimilar to what we've just been discussing, of course, is NATO and the European Union, bringing those two bodies together, being forced to consider what their future is, being forced to consider what their commitment and their dedication is to the future of those alliances, and asked very deep and searching questions, and of course act very, very quickly as well in terms of having to reorientate. We look at Poland, talk of 500,000 conscripted people, soldiers in the army, a massive uptick in defence commitment there. The UK trying to go down a similar line, and yet it appears that any chance of realistically increasing the size of the army here and having that uplift as well in terms of materiel is a decade away. But no, I think you're right. NATO for me is the most interesting one. It's in many ways it's the most obvious, but it's the one alliance that is having to really certainly among its more junior members look around and really consider their commitment and their dedication and their concerns about its future.
Leila, just finally on this, and with advance apologies for dropping breaking news on you, but it does go to what you were saying about this thing Donald Trump does where he just announces something which is quite plainly mad, which does at least have the effect of getting other people thinking about, well, what else can we be doing? News just coming in out of Riyadh. The United States says it will immediately restore intelligence sharing and security assistance to Ukraine. Ukraine says it is ready to accept a US proposal for a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. This follows those talks in Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's clear yet how enthusiastic Russia is about this. But if it turns out that Russia has been bounced into a 30-day ceasefire, which would be a start, I mean, it may yet presage some other complete screw-up or ghastly betrayal, but I'm sure many, many Ukrainians would be quite happy about 30 days of relative peace right now. Does that at least count for a win for bull-in-a-China shop diplomacy?
Well, look, I mean, Trump has had a spectacular win on this, right? As unpopular as it is for everyone, to hear that, I felt terribly sorry for Zelensky, actually, because the problem is that he has been treated like such a hero for the last few years. I mean, to the point where the Democrats had a meeting before he walked into the room with Trump and Vance, all of them just to take selfies with him and kiss the ring. And that's what happens when he goes anywhere around the world. And of course he wears the military uniform, because the whole point is that all these slavish European leaders who want to represent themselves as another Churchill have never had the chance to fight, and here he is fighting a war every day, and they're all completely enthralled to him. So he walked into the room assuming something similar. Right? There was a lot of good stuff going around where people were saying he should have walked in with a medal for Trump. Absolutely right. He should have understood that this is not the same character, that Trump is not a guy who respects people who go to war. He's not that kind of man. He thinks money and business are everything. I did feel very sorry for Zelensky in that situation. And it was very clear afterwards how royally he realised he had screwed up, and sort of the reaction from people back in Ukraine. Just yesterday people were saying this might be his last few days in power. But what Trump has done is put himself in a position where anything he gives back to Ukraine now, Ukraine will be extremely grateful for and very happy to take. And he's already given Russia so much in terms of being willing to have direct talks with Putin that don't involve Ukraine, that, any move back from that is going to be very well received by everyone. Now, obviously, this is great if there is going to be a 30-day ceasefire. Apart from anything else, the reality in the situation, I was talking to somebody who works for the EU the other day, who essentially his job is to go around now and sell this European Defence Fund, who's sitting in rooms with generals. And I was saying to him, is there any way that EU leaders could even put a drop in the bucket of what the US is pulling away from funding? Of course, that they had over 60% of what's been sent to Ukraine so far is from the US. And even that amount is only holding the line, right? The reality is Ukraine is not getting that territory back as much as people might want to believe they do. So a ceasefire is necessary to stop another 10,000 young men dying this year. So that's great news. The other thing here is that this is generational. I was having a really interesting conversation actually with my father the other day, who's very much of that generation of post-Second World War Europe. It must be the absolute priority, European defence. And I was saying to him, look, you've built a world that we all believed in, right? There was a structure, and all these structures now over the last decade or more have been collapsing. The economic wealth that we thought we were coming into hasn't worked. The EU hasn't worked, unfortunately, because of political realities in this country, and the same with defence. do you really believe, in terms of, Starmer diverting more towards Ukrainian defence, that it can be right that kids in this country don't have enough to eat, the NHS is collapsing, and yet we should be giving more of our taxes to you? And he said, absolutely, of course. The European alliance must be the number one thing. And I said, people my age don't believe that. They're not actually, they don't have that World War II mindset of almost being slightly excited about a war in Europe in our time. They actually want to live their daily lives and be able to survive. So for so many reasons, while it's been done in a very bullish way, anything that can push this war towards a ceasefire that saves lives and money can only be a good thing.
Well, we will have more on that across all our shows tomorrow, of course, starting with The Globalist at 7 a.m. UK time. But now to absolutely outstanding news for our listeners among Utah's dentist community who are about to become extremely busy. Utah has decided to get ahead of America's imminent RFK Jr.-inspired embrace of leeches, trepanning and tying a live crab around the neck to treat mumps, and become the first state in the union to ban fluoride from all public water systems. To think if such a stricture had been enacted in the 1970s, we might never have heard of the Osmonds. Robin, does this at least stop, potentially, Americans making jokes about British teeth?
I think fluoride in our water is a good thing. I remember going to an exhibition at the Wellcome Trust here, which talked about the kind of state of the nation's teeth before fluoride came in, and the improvement in cities across our country, Liverpool and Glasgow, in the years afterwards. This is, I think that kind of nanny statism, and I think that's probably where we're heading in this discussion, to a certain extent, is a good thing. But I'm also someone who believes it's crazy that, people in the US drive around without a helmet on their bikes. So, that's my kind of, that's where the bar is for me.
I feel like we should, Leila, make reference to Utah Governor Spencer Cox, on whose desk this bill now is. He is a Republican, generally comes across as a basically decent sort with something of a sense of humour. And I quote, "It's not a bill I feel strongly about. It's not a bill I care that much about. But it is a bill I will sign."
Well, to be honest, with all the things going on in the US right now, it must be quite satisfying to sign something like this that really doesn't feel like it's going to keep you up at night. Look, I am somebody who believes that the government should do basic goods for its citizens that might not necessarily have the education or the access to know what is best for them, things that don't directly affect their health. But this, of course, absolutely ties into, this new governmental policy in the states of absolutely light touch government and not being involved in anything. It's, while it might be a silly little law, it is very emblematic of so many other things. Now, I've long been very jealous of American teeth. I remember moving to New York when I was 21 and thinking, my God, all the red wine I've been drinking for the last few years and the coffee and what my teeth could look like if I'd made a different effort. So, I hope this won't have an impact on their sparkly whites. They've got so much else to lose at the moment. But I do think, when we're in a situation where, much more terrifyingly, the Trump administration has just pulled funding for vaccine development, that
people are dying of measles in Texas.
People are dying of measles in Texas, and people are saying, oh, the reason my child is dying is because they got other vaccines and that's what gave them measles, and that's what's going around on TikTok. So we really are in this sort of terrifying world. There was this meme that a mother put up the other day in Texas where she said, this was not the life I was promised. I'm out here battling 17th century diseases and, armed militias and an assault on my body and my rights as a woman to leave the house. I really didn't think this is where this was going, but this is where this is going. So actually, I think these small little things that have been won so hard, particularly in the States, for the government to protect the health of people, do need to be debated very carefully, because otherwise it is, a terrible expression, but that slippery slope towards everything being pulled. And if it's an easy way to save money, it's clear that this government will do that.
Just finally then, having outed you both as ardent nanny staters, I did want to ask you each in turn if there are laws, big or small, that you would impose on the public for their own good. I mean, I can think of a very long list. I would, however, genuinely make it entirely illegal to manufacture or sell phones which can play audio out loud without earphones.
It's so obvious we were going down that road, isn't it?
Yep.
On public transport.
Anywhere.
Yeah, I don't want to hear your side of the conversation on your phone when you're 4 seats down in the train.
That's mine. Is there something that you would impose, Robin, for the common good?
Well, I think I'm probably with you on this one. It's probably the phones, yeah. I will add, though, there was not so much a law, but I did a piece of reporting when I was in China about some people that are Dua Lipa concert, actually, who were being banned from standing up. And I discovered as well, this is the same problem that George Michael had back in the 80s when he was the first big Western musician to go to China after it opened up. You can't stand up at concerts there because it's just too much fun. It's too disruptive.
I'm heartily in favour of this as well. I believe all music should just be consumed in respectful silence. Leila, are there any things that you would impose for the public's own good?
Tied to absolutely no recent experiences in my life whatsoever, I would demand that all Uber drivers and rideshare drivers have to take the same London cabbie test that black cab drivers have to take. No, I would also people really disagree with this, but I ardently agree with the sugar tax. I do think that so many forms of fast food should be banned or severely restricted.
As does Robert F. Kennedy, who we were touching on earlier.
Absolutely, yeah. I really think that it's so strange that kind of that level of freedom is given to things that are actively killing us. While on the other hand, we're restricting things like alcohol and cigarettes, which, to be clear, also are a problem, but we kind of don't recognise the absolute epidemic that's happening, with young people in this country and obesity. And the reality is that even if they manage to lose that weight later, the psychological impact, obviously, of that, but also it's going to affect their health permanently. And something that makes me really angry is these new kind of weight loss injections, that people kind of turn around and say things like, oh, it's cheating. Doctors have found the key to solving the biggest health crisis of our lifetimes. And you are telling obese people that they're cheating by taking this medicine? It's mad to me. So I would also make it mandatory the NHS should have to prescribe that medicine to all people who are overweight and save their lives and allow them to live a healthier and longer life.
Happier policies for a sensible nation, or the other way around. Leila, Molana-Allen and Robin Brant, thank you for joining us. Finally on today's show, a story from Palestine about that state's lone violin maker, Shahada Shalalda. Shahada spoke with Liam Syed about the quest for the survival of Palestinian music and culture.
While his friends dreamed of playing music, as a child, Shahada Shalalda was captivated by a different aspect of the art, the crafting of instruments themselves. This passion led him to a discovery that would define his life's purpose. Palestine, let alone his home city of Ramallah, had no violin maker of its own.
Really most of my friends, they like to see how this instrument was played. Me, I was interested more how the instrument was made from the beginning, because I like a lot handwork, especially with wood, since I'm young. And I had a little workshop at home when I was young to try to create things from nothing. And that's why I was interested in violin maker.
In a land where musical instruments had to be sent outside the wall of separation for repair, Shahada saw an opportunity to tap into Palestine's rich heritage of craftsmanship, a tradition that had persisted through generations despite the daily difficulties of life under occupation. In 2002, the non-profit organisation Al-Kamanjati first opened its doors in Palestine. Its work is dedicated to spreading music horizontally across Palestinian society and protecting Palestinian musical heritage. At that time, Shahada had only seen musical instruments in Tom and Jerry cartoons. His journey to become the country's premier violin maker began in the workshops of local woodcarvers, where the ancient craft of olive wood carving, a hallmark of Palestinian artisanship, became his first teacher.
I started to study by myself, and we have here wood maker a lot in Palestine. I start to go to wood maker to see how they work. It's completely different, but it's wood,
This resourceful approach caught the eyes of Paolo Sergentoni, a master violin maker from Florence, who saw both talent and necessity in Shahada.
He says, it's good you can be a good violin maker, and they need you in Palestine.
This recognition led to 3 transformative months in Sergentoni's workshop, followed by a more formal training at the Newark School of Violin Making in Nottinghamshire, England. Returning home, Shahada established his workshop with Al-Kamanjati, and his impact soon extended beyond Ramallah. He served music schools across the West Bank and even travelled to Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. During his visits, he not only repaired instruments, but taught communities how to care for them themselves.
I went there and I fixed instrument for there, and I give a workshop there how to take care of the instrument, and how, if I am not there, how to take care of the instrument. And because they're Palestinian really poor, they cannot send them instrument to violin maker to fix. So I used to go volunteer with Al-Kamanjati.
Today, he reflects on the devastation wrought by Israel's war on Gaza in response to Hamas's attack on October the 7th.
The schools now is finished. They destroyed them, the schools. Now there is no anymore school.
The destruction extends beyond buildings. It represents the erasure of cultural spaces that will take years to rebuild, the loss of irreplaceable Palestinian musicians and teachers, and the displacement of traumatized students who may never return to their musical education. Israel's occupation casts a long shadow over Palestinian musical life. Al-Kamanjati has built a network of music schools across multiple cities, but this cultural web is torn apart by checkpoints and travel restrictions. Teachers often find themselves unable to reach their students, separated from their classrooms by barriers and permits. Each journey between cities becomes an exercise in courage and uncertainty. A settler violence rises in the West Bank.
You know, when you go from England to another country, you say to your family goodbye. But here, from city to city, we say to the family goodbye, because you don't know on the road what will happen. Most of my friends left Palestine, and this is really makes sense, because always when you try to fight with them, I don't want them to leave, because this country wants us. You know, we want to build it. We want to make Palestinian great.
Despite these challenges, Shahada's workshop remains open. His tools are still shaping and repairing the instruments that give voice to Palestinian cultural expression. His presence in Ramallah represents a form of resistance through creation. Every violin he repairs, every student he teaches, becomes part of a larger struggle to maintain Palestinian cultural life. The year 2019 marked what Shahada considers his best experience and his dream, a journey to Gaza, a part of Palestine he had never visited due to Israel's severe restrictions on movement between Palestinian territories. With support from the Belgian consulate, he worked at the Edward Said Music School, training others in instrument repair.
I was really happy. I was so happy experience, because they are really, really nice people and really hospitality. And we fixed many instruments with really from my heart. I used to work, really enjoy a lot. I was open to fix an instrument free, like without money. I want to help. I want to do something.
Liam Syed, thank you for that report. That is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Robin Brant and Leila Molana-Allen. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Francesca Julks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.